My pleasure today to introduce our seminar speaker, Doug Swesty. He is at Stony Brook. His undergrad was at Penn State, and then he did his PhD at Stony Brook, working with Jim Latimer, where they produced the famous Latimer-Swesty equation of state for dense matter. He then was an NSF computational science postdoctoral associate at NCSA and became visiting research professor in the Department of Astronomy at Illinois, where he hired me as his postdoc, and I'm still grateful for that. Then a few years later, he returned to Stony Brook, and he's going to tell us today, and I don't have the title in front of me, but go ahead, Doug.
Let me share, and then I will put the title. Everybody will see the title. So, okay. Hopefully you can all see my slides here now. I get a yes from somebody?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
All right. So the title is self-explanatory here, the propagation of incertitude through computer simulations. If you don't know what incertitude is, you will shortly. This talk is full of incertitude. At any rate, I just want to first mention all of the contributors that contributed to this work. I'm only a small part of this, and much of this work has been done by our current or former students here at Stony Brook. And I especially want to mention here, and I've got her name highlighted along with mine, Naomi Gluck, who is here today. She is one of our undergraduates about to graduate and become one of our former students. She'll be headed off to Yale in the fall, but she's going to give the latter third of this talk. In addition to myself and Naomi, there's Alan Calder. Scott Ferson, who was here as an adjunct, he was a graduate of the Department of Ecology and Evolution, is a world-renowned expert in uncertainty quantification, and now is heading a department at University of Liverpool in that area. Melissa Hoffman, who's the Johns Hopkins Space Telescope Science Institute now. Max Katz, one of our former PhD students who, and by the way, I'll give a shout out since Robert's listening. Max got his job at NVIDIA Corporation as a direct result of the fellow that we had here giving a talk from NVIDIA, running a school on how to basically do GPU programming. That connected Max, and that's how Max ended up at NVIDIA, specifically through that program that IACS ran. And Don Wilcox, who is now a postdoc at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, actually a scientist now at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So with those credits out of the way, let me start talking about uncertainty quantification in computer simulations. It means different things to different people, and uncertainty is ubiquitous throughout computer simulations. We see it all the time. Perhaps the most notable example that we encounter in our everyday lives, especially here on Long Island, is in a few months, we're going to start worrying about hurricanes again. And every time we worry about hurricanes, we see one of these plots from the National Hurricane Center that basically puts the track here, and we're always wondering whether we're going to have it hit Long Island or not. And they put out these forecast cones, and these forecast cones are an example of doing uncertainty quantification, although this is not a very good example of uncertainty quantification, because when I first looked into how the National Hurricane Center did this, I was deeply disappointed, because essentially what they do is take their previous models and basically figure out what percentage of the time they were wrong. Right. And so this forecast cone here basically means that this is 2/3 of the time their models will go within this track, and 1/3 of the time it will not. It's not a very formal way of doing uncertainty quantifications. They've done thousands and thousands and thousands of models, and they're just simply looking after the fact, you know, a posteriori, how many times were we right or how many times were we wrong, and basically base these cones off of that. So it's not a really good method of doing uncertainty quantification. There are lots of other fields where uncertainty quantification comes into play in computer simulations, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but things where you think of as very critical: weather forecasting, obviously, climate models. We'd like to know how much is the climate going to warm, how much is sea level going to rise. Those are things where we seriously have to worry about uncertainty quantification. Forest fire behavior models, astrophysical simulations, combustion models, nuclear reactor models of both fission and fusion type, and nuclear weapons modeling. And I mentioned this last one in particular because since the United States, even though we haven't signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, we haven't tested a nuclear weapon since the early 1990s. And virtually all of our stockpile reliability has been based on computer simulations. And for that reason, the National Nuclear Security Administration has been one of the biggest driving forces right now in figuring out how to do uncertainty quantification in computer simulations. So there's a lot of work coming out of the nuclear weapons labs here in the United States, Los Alamos and Livermore and Sandia, on how to do uncertainty quantification in simulations, because all of our modeling of our nuclear stockpile comes out of that. Now, in astrophysics, which is what we do, our computer simulations and propagation uncertainty are not done very well, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the thing that applies here is what I'll call the fundamental theorem of simulations. Uncertain inputs are going to mean uncertain outputs, and there are lots of uncertain inputs in astrophysical simulations. We have all sorts of input parameters that we have to deal with, and what we want to try to figure out is how to quantify the uncertainty in simulations as a result of those uncertain outputs. Given those uncertain inputs, can we quantify the uncertainty of the output? And the ultimate goal of this work, from what we're trying to do right now, is to raise the bar in doing uncertainty quantification in computational astrophysics. Now, that being said, the bar is very, very low right now. So almost anything we do raises the bar somewhat, but we'd like to come up with some better ways of doing it. But first, let me talk about what uncertainty quantification means here just for a minute. There are two types of uncertainty quantification I'll discuss here. Or I'm only going to discuss one of them, but I'll break it up into two categories, I should say. The first one is what we call forward UQ. That is, given uncertain inputs, what is the uncertainty in the output of our simulations? And input uncertainties can be determined by various means: experimental or observational bounds, other research, intuition. Those are obviously in decreasing order of reliability. And there's also the problem of inverse UQ, which we face, especially in computational astrophysics. Given experimental or observational data and the uncertainties in the measurement of that data, what are the uncertainties in input parameters to simulations that can still model the data? That is, if we use our simulations to try and reproduce something we see, how can we basically say what range of parameters reproduce that data that we actually observe? That's a more complicated problem, and I'm not going to deal with that in this talk, but I did want to mention it. Now, what about the input uncertainties? How can we characterize those? Well, I'll break those up into several categories. The first one is stochastic variability, what is also known as alleatory uncertainty, alleatory being another word for random. It's characterized by randomness. Things that vary randomly, you can think of as basically being characterized by some sort of probability distribution or a cumulative distribution function. And there are a variety of techniques for UQ that exist for doing this with simulations. Some of them are somewhat non-sophisticated, carrying out an ensemble of simulations and simply observe the distribution of the outputs. There are ways to basically using stratified sampling and Latin hypercubes to basically focus in on regions and try and quantify uncertainties associated with alleatory uncertainty in a better way. And there are lots of those can be put to work, and I'm not going to talk about those today because what we're going to be focused on here is the other kind of uncertainty for inputs, which is incertitude. Incertitude is also known as epistemic uncertainty, and it's characterized by ignorance, and there's lots of ignorance in astronomy. The input parameters in incertitude have definite values, but we don't know what it is. A great example of that in astrophysical simulations is we don't know the rate at which in a star, carbon-12 burns into oxygen via a rate called the C12 alpha gamma rate. It's something that we cannot measure in the laboratory very well. There are lots of nuclear reaction rates we can measure well in the laboratory. The C12 alpha gamma rate is not one of them. It's varies widely based on experimental estimates, and it's critical for doing things, all right? It has a definite value. We just don't know what it is. And that's a great example of an epistemic uncertainty parameter in computational astrophysics. We can often put bounds on ranges of values with incertitude parameters, or incertitudinous parameters, I should say. And it can, in principle, be reduced by more study, research, etc., which you can't do with an alleatory uncertainty. Lastly, I'll also mention another form of uncertainty for computer models, which I'm not going to talk about today, is model uncertainty. We don't know what equations to solve. I'm going to completely ignore that in this talk because I don't have any idea about how to deal with that problem. All right, I'll be quite honest about it. All right, so let's talk about forward propagation of incertitude in computer simulations, now that we know what incertitude is. In first-year physics labs, we teach students to do this all the time. And forward UQ of incertitude is easy in our first-year physics labs. We have the students do something with a circuit. We want them to know the power dissipated in a circuit. We give them the formula P equal IV, that the power is equal to the current I times the voltage V. And the students use a voltmeter and they use an ammeter and they measure the current I and they measure the voltage V, and they estimate some delta I and delta V, the uncertainty in their measurements of I and V. And we ask them, what is the uncertainty then in power? And they can do it by simple just differentials or interval arithmetic. All right, that's fairly easy to do there. But with computer simulations, this is a much more difficult problem because there's some unique challenges associated with computer simulations that we can't really do, right? We can't easily do interval arithmetic. There have been attempts to basically introduce interval arithmetic into computer simulations, including systems to try and automate a code, that the conversion of a code to do interval arithmetic, but they have not been widely successful. And it's a very difficult problem, right? Except in perhaps the simplest simulations. It also could be very costly. The simulations themselves can be very costly. If we're doing large-scale runs on supercomputers, on very high-performance systems with hundreds of thousands of cores on them, it would be very, very prohibitive to try and basically convert that to interval arithmetic. It may just simply not be possible. And the simulations themselves are very costly, and that limits what we can do as far as forward UQ. And then the biggest problem, perhaps, is the fact that the simulation codes can be sort of black boxes here. They take inputs and they spit out outputs. The people who are often running the codes are not the people who architected the code. They have no idea how it works. They just depend on it for things. And we're going to show you an example of that today with a community code that's widely used in computational astrophysics. And the source code in these codes may be extremely complicated. That's very common to have packages that have tens or hundreds of thousands of lines of code in them. The source code may be inaccessible. It could be proprietary, and you just simply have no access to it. So we need to come up with algorithms that can deal with uncertainty quantification in black boxes, and that's really what we're headed towards. So let me formulate the idea of a black box mathematically so we can think about it. Let's suppose we have some incertitudinous input parameter, I'll call it eta, that perhaps we have some bounds on it that we can go between eta min and eta max, and those are constrained by some sort of knowledge on that. Maybe it's experimental or observational, or even just some intuition, even though that may be a very poor form of information. It may be all we have. So that gives us some range of this input parameter, delta eta, to the simulation. Now we can think of the simulation as being this function, the black box, which I'll call capital B here, which takes eta as an input and it spits out some value y. And then what we want to know is, given the input delta eta here, and this is an equation right now, given that this equation would make mathematicians shudder, because here I'm taking in a scalar value, here I'm putting in a range as an argument, but I think we all understand what I mean. Is we want the simulation to basically be able to feed in somehow information about the possible variation of eta and get out of it some variation in an output, right? Now the output may not even be a scalar, and that's another problem in its own right, and I'm not going to talk about that today either, but let's just assume we're looking at a single number coming out of our simulation that we want to know the range of. The question is, how can we find that? Now, I'll also point out that you can't assume that this black box is a monotonic function. So that means you can't say delta y, well, we'll just evaluate at the upper end of the incertitudinous range, right, or incertitude range, and the lower end of the certitude range, take the difference between them, and that gives you delta y. That may not be the case. Y may peak somewhere in between the two. And in fact, in reality, we don't just have a single parameter going in, we have a whole bunch of parameters, n parameters, all of which have some incertitude associated with them. And there may be also inputs that are alleatory on this as well, which have stochastic variability associated with them. And those, as I mentioned, can be dealt with by a variety of techniques, of which there's quite a big background literature on that. And I won't really discuss that today. And I don't consider myself to have a lot of expertise in that area. So the state of the art in incertitude UQ and computational astrophysics can be summed up as being, quite frankly, terrible, right? We just simply don't have any formal mechanism for doing it up to this point. There's literally nothing that people do except for two widely used approaches, both of which are bad, right? One is to carry out simulations for a grid of input parameters in an attempt to overcome the lack of interval arithmetic that's available in our simulations. If we could do interval arithmetic, if we could really take, simulations that basically we could feed intervals into, we could deal with incertitude quite easily. But in fact, we really can't in practice. So if we have any input parameters, if you want to do this sort of grid evaluation technique, you have to create an n-dimensional grid. It's totally impractical unless there are a few input parameters, and the simulations are very computationally inexpensive. But the fact of the matter is most of the stuff that we do in computational astrophysics these days takes fairly big simulations, and we simply can't really do that approach very well. The other technique that's often used is to uniformly randomly sample the input parameter space. That is, we pick random points, sampling uniformly out of our incertitude range, and plug them into the code, our black box, and basically see what comes out of it, and basically say that, okay, this gives us some indication about the variation of the outputs. This is a very common technique, but there's absolutely no rational reason for treating a parameter characterized by an incertitude with a distribution, even if it's uniform. Yet this is done all over the place in computational astrophysics, and it has bad results. I can vastly underestimate the output uncertainty, even for the simplest black box codes, if more than a few input parameters are present. And I'm going to show you an example of that now. Here's an example of a black box code that I've used, right, that has an incertitude of 10 input parameters. And I've set this up so each input parameter is bounded in its incertitude by the values of 0 and 1. So input parameter xi here, and I really should have had a to I here. I was being inconsistent in my notation, where I will vary from 1 to 10 for these parameters, all right? Each one of those varies over the range of 0 to 1. Even with a large number of simulations, here's what I get out of my black box code when I calculate the outputs and look at the maximum and minimum as a function of the number. It isn't showing here very well, as the function of the number of simulations I'm doing. I got cut off there for some reason. This should say number of simulations on the x-axis here, the horizontal axis, I should say. And here are my upper and lower bounds of my incertitude range as a function of the number of simulations, right? So with just a few simulations, maybe 2 simulations would say a minimum, let's say, I would have this estimate and the red line for the upper bound of the output incertitude, and the green point here for the lower bound. As I increase the number of simulations, you can see that gets wider and wider, and it doesn't really look like it's converging, and it isn't. All right. And that's simply because now I've gone to 10 million simulations here, and it still hasn't converged. And you might say, well, gee, okay, Doug constructed some really diabolically evil function to thwart this technique. Let me show you what the black box was. It's a linear sum. That's all it is. It's just basically taking the number of the parameter 1 times 1, 2 times parameter 2, plus 3 times parameter 3, and so on. It's about as simple a black box function as I could easily do, which is why I could easily do 10 million simulations in a minute or two on my notebook. But this incredibly simple linear black box function effectively thwarted the strategy of uniform sampling. It just simply doesn't work. So what can we do that's better for forward incertitude propagation in black box simulations? And what we're going to talk about here are 2 methods that we're currently testing. This work is ongoing, and I'm going to talk about these methods, and then I'm going to hand off and let Naomi basically talk about the work she's been doing to carry this out using a community astrophysics code and evaluate how these methods work and some of the things, problems that we're encountering, and some of the things that we need to do a little bit better now. So the two methods we're testing are known as the Koshi Deviants method, and I'll talk about that one first, and then the quadratic response surface method. All right, these are methods that have been developed and used in other areas, all right, but not very widely adopted at this point. And this is a big problem. The quantification of incertitude for black box codes is a really difficult problem. And Scott Ferson, who's one of our collaborators here, gave a talk, who's now at University of Liverpool, as I mentioned, gave a talk here in the Society and Technology Department, or Tech and Society Department here 2 weeks ago. And he mentioned this briefly, that this is one of the biggest problems, basically risk analysis and uncertainty quantification right now, the lack of techniques for doing this with black box codes. So what we're trying to do here is really, as simple as it is groundbreaking for astronomy and astrophysics, and anything we can do, as I said, will help. So let me first talk about the Koshi Deviants method. And I want to think about the black box as a map here, where it's going to take these input parameters, eta1 through eta(n), which have some incertitude associated with each parameter. And it's going to have some output here, which I'll call capital O. When fed in the input parameter incertitude ranges, the delta etas here, we want to get out the incertitude output range. We want to know how wide is that variation, right? And we can think of the black box as really just being a mapping that stretches or squishes these input intervals, delta eta I, to produce this output, delta eta O. Now, if we could measure this stretching and squishing of the map B, we would know how the incertitude is propagated, right? If we could do uncertainty and interval arithmetic there, no problem. We could do it easily, all right? So bring on the Koshi Deviants method. And when I first tell you about this, you're going to seem incredulous. You will be incredulous, right? Because it seems like insanity, right? But it actually makes sense after you think about it. And this is a method that was developed by Kranovich and Ferson, Scott Ferson, who I said is one of our collaborators. And it was developed for the purposes of risk analysis. And we're using it here for astrophysical black boxes. And the idea is we're going to use a Koshi distribution and random sampling to find out how the black box maps input incertitude intervals to output incertitude, right? Now that might seem like madness given what I've told you. Incertitude cannot be characterized by randomness. And there's absolutely no reason that we would use uniform sampling. There's no rational reason to use uniform sampling to cover the input incertitude range. So why would we use a distribution function to characterize an incertitude? Well, the short answer is we're not. We're going to exploit a unique property mathematically of the Koshi distribution in order to basically see how much stretching there is. And the way this works is, let me tell you about the Koshi distribution here if you're not familiar with it. The Koshi distribution is given by this function here, delta over pi times z squared plus delta squared. All right, delta is going to set the full width at half maximum of this Koshi distribution, which is what I've depicted here. We've depicted here and several different Koshi distributions with several different deltas here. The one that's black is often called the standardized Koshi distribution, where the full width half maximum is 1. At halfway down the peak, this width here is 1. All right. Now, this is known in physics by the Lorentz distribution or the Bright-Wigner distribution, and I'm sure in other fields it's got other names as well, all right, but it's got some interesting properties to it. One of which, and the one that's important to us here, is that a linear sum of Koshi distributions has a unique property. The linear sum of Koshi distributions is itself a Koshi distribution, and that's true of other distribution functions. But what's unique to the Koshi distribution is that the linear sum has the property that the full width half maximum of this sum over n Koshi distribution functions has a full width half maximum, which I'll call delta here to distinguish it from delta I. And that delta is that linear combination of the full width half maxima for each of the individual distributions, right? So given that if we know the full width half maxima of each input Koshi distribution function, we can calculate what the if we know what the linear combination is, we can calculate what the full width half maximum of the output would be. Or conversely, right, if we could measure this, we kind of know how much each of these individual things is stretched to put the maximum. And that's what we're going to exploit here. So the Koshi Deviants method is, the strategy is we want to see how the black box maps the input full width half maxima for Koshi distributed input parameters into an output full width half maxima. And this relationship, by the way, I should say is true as long as this is a linear combination. So this depends on our black box being approximately linear, right? We'll talk about what happens if that isn't true in a minute, all right? We will input a bunch of Koshi distributed values for these incertitude parameters, right? And look at the distribution of the output parameters. Will make no use of the statistical properties of the output distribution at all, right? We don't make any probabilistic interpretation of the output distribution. All we're looking to see is what is the full width half maximum of the distribution of the output, because then that tells us how much stretching or squishing of the input parameters there are. So we'll use the delta of the output distribution to infer how the intervals delta eta I have been propagated into an uncertainty delta eta O, right? So the algorithm for this then is we simply generate a set of Cauchy deviates for each input parameter over the incertitude range, evaluate the black box for this set of deviates. Output distribution delta can be obtained by using the method of maximum likelihood applied to the set of the output deviates. I'm not going to talk about the details of that here. I'll point you to a paper we have published already on this. And really, we didn't invent this. This was Kranovich and Fursten that did this. I don't want to take any credit for that at all, right? But we make no use of the statistical properties as distribution. So we're not basically characterizing inputs as in a probabilistic fashion. We're just using this unique property of the Cauchy distribution of the linear combination here to see how much stretching or squishing this black box mapping does. Now, what if the black box isn't linear? Then our strategy is to break up the input parameter into domains that are approximately linear subdomains, where you can apply this method on each subdomain, each tile of this larger space in parameter space. And we'll show you an example of that, how we've done that in a community code coming up. So how does Cauchy deviates do if I apply it to that toy black box that I showed you compared to uniform sampling, right? Here's the same plot now, but I'll show you what Cauchy deviates basically gives you. Even with two simulations here, Cauchy deviates basically nailed things pretty closely, right, to the true upper and lower bound of this. Right, and that's simply because it's a linear function. It's quite easy to do. We didn't have to do a lot of simulations. Compare this to what we had from the uniform sampling technique, and you still see it hadn't reached the rates here that basically Cauchy deviates got from just simply two samples. All right. It seems to work very well. We're going to try it on a more realistic example shortly here that Naomi will show you. There's another interesting property I don't have time to talk about, unfortunately. One of the neat things about this Cauchy deviates method is that we can use a statistical property of the Cauchy deviates to tell us how many samples we really need to do, given how many input parameters there are, to get a reliable estimate of how much stretching and squishing there is, right, to a 1 sigma, 2 sigma, or 3 sigma level, right? In the example that Naomi is going to show you in the first work that we did, you needed at least 200 simulations to actually accurately map the output incertitude level to the 3 sigma confidence level there. All right, and for the details of that, I'll refer you to our paper. Let me talk about the second method, which we'll show you an application of when Naomi takes over here in a minute, and it's known as the quadratic response surface method. This was developed by Kranovich et al. Scott Fursten was also one of the co-authors on this, as was Lev Ginsberg from the Department of Ecology and Evolution, and Troy Tucker, who works for Lev's company right down the street, Applied Biomathematics. They were all part of this as well, in addition to a number of other authors. The idea is you model the output of the black box by fitting a response surface that's quadratic in form, something of this form. You have a function of the input parameters eta has this quadratic form to it here. And you're going to fit the surface to that. And you're simply going to basically, once you have done this, basically find the maximum and minimum of that surface to get an estimate of the output incertitude. And hopefully this response surface approximates the behavior of the black box over the range of the incertitude. And there's always a question there. Could there be some unique point that has a widely varying value within your incertitude range that basically wouldn't be captured by the fact that you're fitting this to a finite set of simulations that you've done? But the idea behind this, that as it was originally formulated, was that you can find the extrema of the response surface over the domain of input parameters. Now, this can be done analytically using Lagrange multiplier methods if the input domain is elliptic in shape, right? That is, if I have incertitude ranges in two parameters, they're called x tilde here, or x and x1 and x2 here. If this represents the incertitude range of my x1 parameter and this represents the incertitude range of my x2 parameter, there's my full incertitude range. It doesn't look like an ellipse, but if you could make it look like an ellipse, then you could easily estimate from this quadratic surface analytically what the maximum and minimum are. So you could have two choices of elliptical domains that basically try to approximate this rectangular incertitude domain. And one would be an inscribed ellipse here depicted by this sort of green ellipse, and the other one would be a circumscribed ellipse depicted by this sort of purplish ellipse here. And they have different advantages and disadvantages to them. The inscribed ellipse can miss points down here that could be important for characterizing your full incertitude range of your output. If you do this, this characterizes the full incertitude range, but you may have to use your black box in ranges where it's incapable of evaluating or producing a result. Maybe for this value of a parameter delta x1 or x2 down here, your black box simply won't function or it gives something unphysical. All right, that's a possibility. So it's got a problem there. We've since come up with a better way of doing this now, where we numerically find the maxima and minima of the response surface. And we can do that for this simple quadratic problem, which wouldn't be easily done as a general optimization problem, because it'd be a box constrained optimization problem, which is a really numerically difficult thing to do. We're going to look at a case study, and I'm going to let Naomi take it over from here, because this is really her work on her senior thesis, which she just got approved, and I'll let her shine with this. So Naomi, it's all yours.
Thank you very much.
Tell me when you want me to change slides.
Will do. Can everyone hear me? Is my volume okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So the case study that I've been working on is looking at the incertitude of white dwarf masses under stellar wind loss. So generally stars evolve, and through that evolution, specifically here we're looking at low mass stars that are one solar mass comparable to our sun. They evolve through stages, and within each stage, a star has to lose mass just by virtue of evolving. And this evolution is powered by nuclear fusion of lighter elements, hydrogen and helium, into heavier elements, anything past hydrogen and helium. So we first see the fusion of hydrogen in stellar cores into helium. And so this describes the evolutionary track that is labeled as the main sequence, where stars remain for a pretty long period of time in terms of their general lifespan. They spend a lot of time on the main sequence. Your second fusion is between helium and carbon in the core. And this is called the red giant branch. So stars here will have a, depending on how far along they are in the red giant branch, they'll have a helium carbon core, an outer shell of helium, just helium, and then the outermost shell will be usually just hydrogen. Then the last phase of fusion is between carbon and oxygen and any other heavier elements, which will depend on the mass that it initially started with at the main sequence. And this is called the asymptotic giant branch. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the Hertzsprung-Russell, or HR diagram for short. And it generally shows the evolutionary track of a star throughout its lifetime. This particular HR diagram is for M5, the Messier cluster. So although it doesn't show the track of one singular star throughout its life, it's taking this cluster and taking all of the stars in it as a whole. So if you can see on the graph, the maroon colored stars, that is the main sequence. Then following that, you have the orange dots in the RGB phase. Following that is the AGB phase. And then you have the horizontal branch in yellow. And so this is just really taking a snapshot of this cluster at a specific time. This is, when you have a white dwarf, you would not see it on this graph as it is, as white dwarfs are characterized by having a really hot temperature, but a very, very low luminosity. And you'll see that, I think, on the next slide. You can go ahead, or in a few slides from now. So planetary nebula are formed via these winds that occur in both the RGB and AGB phases. So with these winds, you lose mass and you start to form a planetary nebula. And what you'll find is a reduced mass white dwarf in the center. Sometimes you can see them with your naked eye, like in the Cat's Eye Nebula. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to spot. It's not super clear in the Ring Nebula. And some of the questions that we are covering is, within a simulation, is what is the final mass of the white dwarf that is produced? And how does it depend on the strength of these winds? You can go ahead. Okay, so looking at the stellar winds in white dwarf stars, the winds are really occurring in the RGB and AGB phases, and these winds are driven by stellar luminosity. They're modeled empirically, where you have the Reimer's mass loss rate, which is dominant in the RGB phase, and then you have the Blücher mass loss rate, which is more dominant in the AGB phase. And you see that the parameters eta R and eta B are incertitudinous, and this is really what we're measuring, what we're looking at through simulations, and the strength of these parameters will determine really how much mass is lost throughout a star's evolutionary path. Go ahead. Okay. So in order to do this, if you recall a few slides back, we talked about using code as a black box. And so this is exactly what we did with MESA, an open source code, so everyone can use it, modules for experiments in stellar astrophysics, where our goal is to understand the uncertainty in the final white dwarf mass, given the incertitude inherent in stellar wind parameters. Okay, there's that blue box you're talking about. Okay.
I'm sorry, I screwed that up in my formatting, my fault.
That's all right. So for a simulation, the general runtime for just a singular star of one solar mass can vary between 2.5 to 3 hours running on one core. In this instance, we did groups of six simulations together on 4 cores. And if everything works out well, you'll also have around the same time, 2.5 to 3 hours. However, if there are issues in calculations with the code and the code struggles with it, simulations can go up to 10 hours, sometimes more. That's on the really high end of things. I've experienced that. So in total, I worked through around 800 simulations. And so we're looking at 3 grids of 256 runs each. So the 3 grids are one of a evenly spaced grid, the second of a uniform random grid, and a third of Koshi Deviants grid. So you have 131 groups of 6 runs each. And if there are no issues and you just continuously run simulation group after simulation group, it's around 50 hours of runtime. It was a lot more because there were a few issues that we had run into. All of these simulations are not done directly on my computer. They're done through the Seawolf cluster, where you submit run files into a queue. You wait for there to be enough computational power to handle your simulation, and then it's automatic from there. And so these issues that I had run into were because of the grid resolution that I originally took from the previous paper that everything is based on. And so you have these 2 parameters that control the grid. So the first is the mesh delta control. The default value, and what we ended up using, is 0.5. And so this directly deals with the grid size. So for a smaller number, you have a finer grid space. And the second is the VAR control target. This is the range that we used. We ended up picking 5.0 d to the -4th. And so this controls the time step. And usually in simulations, for successful simulation, you want something that converges. If the simulation has issues with convergence, what the VAR control target will do is reduce the time step and try to rerun from a last save point, something like that, to try to get the simulation to go through. You can go to the next slide. So there are two ways that you can define a successful run. The first way and the most obvious way is that if a simulation completes the 3 enlists, and an enlist is really a code checkpoint, and these checkpoints kind of match up with stellar evolution checkpoints. So within MESA, they're labeled as enlist start, enlist to AGB, and enlist to white dwarf. And so you can kind of see the correlation there. And in MESA, you'll get this, at the end of the output file, you'll get a message that says that this simulation has completed all 3 enlists or something along those lines. The second way that a successful run can be defined is if it reaches the envelope mass limit or luminosity limit. And this is something that took me a little bit of time to figure out because it doesn't tell you directly at the end. It's kind of hidden within the output file. And sometimes it still runs for a little bit, realizes that a white dwarf is—
Nicole, you look so good today. I'm so excited to see your face later.
I have no idea who that is.
all right. Anyway, so you have these 2 different error messages that basically you'll see in the output file. And so the first has to do with the envelope mass. And so if the envelope mass is larger than 0.1 solar masses, the simulation will write that out in an error message, and you know that a white dwarf is formed. Or the other way is if a error message appears with the log of the surface luminosity is less than 0.1 solar luminosities, that's also another indication of a successful simulation that a white dwarf has been produced. And so at first, many of these runs that had an error message were thought to be incomplete at first. Took a little bit of time to realize that these were actually successful simulations. They are, and you can check this by just looking at the final mass of the white dwarf, and it does fall within both the range that I expected it to fall into by doing the resolution study and by observational astronomy and looking at where most white dwarfs fall. You can go ahead to the next slide. So between the old model and the new model, which is what I'm working on, a few changes were made. So the Reimer's wind parameter originally was measured between 0.3 and 0.9. I changed that to 0.4 to 0.9, just because at 0.3, there were a lot of issues and many of the simulations did not go through. And then we have the Blücher wind parameter. And this I found to be really the cause of the divergence of most of these simulations. So at first it was between 0 and 0.1. I raised it up quite a bit between 0.1 and 0.5. And I think that this gives a more accurate representation in terms of final white dwarf masses. We also increased the number of runs per suite. At first it was 200, now it's at 256. And I think in general, it was at 200 at first, just because it's easier to manage the grid size and to get that 3 sigma confidence that you want in your Incertitude measurements. You can go ahead. So when you're modeling these models suffer from real world problems. In some of the regions, it should be A to R, A to B of that parameter space, which you can see in the figure. You obviously some models fail just by virtue of the equations that are governed and are put into MESA, which you saw previously, the 2 mass loss rate equations. Some combinations of numbers just don't work. So in the figure, the red dots are simulations or combinations of Reimers and Bruker wind parameters that failed. There are some still that are actually incomplete, where there's no error message, they just kind of stopped, and we're still really not sure why that is. And then all of the green points are successful simulations. And again, this could be because of algorithm failure or because of unphysical combination of parameters. Okay, so as you saw previously for a HR diagram of a cluster or a snapshot of a cluster, this is what an HR diagram looks like for a white dwarf. A little bit different, but this is also specifically for the evenly spaced suite. And so you can see again at the very bottom where the evolutionary path is around -1 for the log of the solar luminosity, and at the 4.4 in the log of the temperature, white dwarfs have a really high temperature but a low luminosity, and this is their path. And what's interesting to see is how different with the exception of where they end up, the path that they take is quite different, and that is by virtue of these varying wind parameters. So this shows really how sensitive all of these equations are to even the slightest change in either wind parameter. You can go to the next slide. So, oh, Professor, you're going to say something?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry. So we employed both Cauchy deviates and the QRS methods to quantify the final white dwarf mass from a series of MESA simulations where the wind parameters had incertitude, and we also were comparing to a UQ from a uniform grid of models and a linear regression of a uniform sampling of models. And so again, it is really costly in terms of time. And so most often what would happen is, because some of these simulations take a really long time to complete, you can set them up right before you go to sleep, wake up in the morning, and they're done. So that is really nice that you can kind of just set things up, have them work out however they work out, and do some analysis whenever they're done. You can go ahead, next slide. So this type of graph is not yet created for the new version, also used with a newer version of MESA, but this is looking at the 200 models from the original study. And so you can see, again, the parameter space, the A to R, the A to B for the wind parameter values. And also, if you look at the gradient, the color gradient on the side, that's showing the mass of the produced white dwarf and solar masses. So the dark purple, black are for lower white dwarfs mass that were produced, and the yellow is for a higher white dwarf mass that was produced. Go ahead. Okay, so also referencing previous slides, tiling was used, and this is how we kind of break up a simulation and make sure that, or make it possible for the Cauchy deviates method to be used. And so what we do is we take the grid space and break it up into, we take the suite and we break it up into approximately linear patches that are a little bit easier to use. And so once we have these linear patches, tiles, we're able to use the Cauchy deviates method. This is, just to approximate the linearity of all of these points and the white dwarf masses. Go to the next slide. So from that, we're able to kind of take all of our data and have a quadratic response surface. And so if you remember the figure previously where you had a rectangle and an ellipse inscribed inside the rectangle and one fitting outside of it, this is a modeling of the quadratic response surface. And as you can probably see, you have a maximum white dwarf mass at 0.6. This is a little bit high, generally speaking, and you get this pretty high upper bound because of the ellipse that is outside of the rectangular grid space. So you have a little bit of an overestimate. The lower bound seems to be pretty consistent. Again, a little bit high due to that ellipse that is outside of your rectangular grid space. You can go ahead to the next slide. So the results from the original study in terms of the mass range. Again, everything is pretty consistent. If you're looking at Cauchy deviates, so linear regression, the QRSM, both for the inner ellipse and the outer ellipse, results are pretty similar, and also even similar to the results that I've gotten with the upgraded version. I've had as a lower mass limit of 0.47 solar masses and an upper limit of 0.53, which is quite low compared to this. And again, I do think that it is because of both the adjustment of both of the parameters, the wind parameters of the space that I used. Next slide. So in the future, we definitely have a lot of work to do. As Professor Swesty said before, this really isn't super carved out. And we can avoid using these elliptical regions of parameter space in the QRS algorithm by finding the extrema numerically. And this is relatively easy to do for a quadratic surface while using a box constrained, the steepest descent methods. And you would need to redo the analysis using this approach. Also, something that we haven't done yet is a convergence analysis of how the estimates of the white dwarf mass range converge with the number of samples. And so MESA also in itself has a few updates. And so just keeping track of these updates and making sure that it still runs in the way it's supposed to does make things, it adds another layer of challenges on top of everything else that is already there. And I think the next slide is just references, one for the Cauchy deviates algorithm, one for the QRS algorithm, and of course the earlier version of this work. So I believe that is all, and I guess open the floor to questions for.
Yeah, I mean, really nice. I mean, guess results and also approach to rigorous incertitude. I guess maybe I can first ask sort of a bit more of a theoretical question. So how does this CD approach sort of relate to sort of like the polynomial chaos approach? And I know polynomial chaos isn't a sampling approach per se, but ultimately it's got this idea of basis functions used to represent the distribution.
I honestly can't answer that question because I really am not familiar with that approach. Frankly, when I first read this paper, I thought this was insanity. It took me a while to understand the Kranovich and Fersen paper because it really, I think it could explain what it was doing better, but I was just flummoxed for weeks to basically understand what was going on until I really got a bigger picture of what was happening here. I don't know. I mean, I simply can't answer your question is the truth. So I have
no,
to
that's fair. No, that's fair.
I mean,
Then in your current understanding, do you think it's able to represent sort of like a multimodal sort of response?
I think it's going to be challenging,
Okay.
truthfully. I mean, you know, as I said, the bar on basically, you know, doing better in computational astrophysics is very, very low at this point.
In any discipline, right?
Yeah.
So, right.
Well, I don't know. Maybe some disciplines are better than others. But I can't speak to other disciplines. I have, you know, I wonder, for example, what happens in climate modeling, for example. I mean, you know, that's obviously got a huge implication for it. And yet, as far as I can tell, there's very little that's been done in that region, in that field, I should say. I have been wondering about that. I mean, you could generalize obviously from quadratic response surface to a higher order response surface. But of course, you know, you run the problem of what we're doing here in this test case involves a few hundred models run. If we were doing big 3D simulations, this would be impractical. We're trying to look at what kind of techniques we could use that when we do 3D hydrodynamic or radiation hydrodynamic simulations of large-scale astrophysical phenomena, are there techniques that we can use that we've tested out on these easier problems, like using this code that only takes 8 to 10 hours to run? Can we come up with a method that would work better so that we could apply it to these larger scale problems? And At this point, I'm uncertain about that. I mean, there's incertitude in that, I guess, is the answer. You could do higher order response surfaces. I've thought about that, but there's, this problem that you could have of Gibbs phenomena emerging in those higher order response surfaces. I mean, if you don't have enough points, you could get all kinds of wild oscillations there. And if there is this multimodal behavior, as you mentioned, in the output of your black box, then you could have problems characterizing it. So we don't have a good solution here right now. It's maybe a little better than what's being done, but I wouldn't call it good. And that's the unfortunate reality of the situation as far as I can see.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
I just have a quick question, and sorry if I missed it at the very beginning, but I don't know if you spoke to the issue of variables being correlated. So this is very relevant. You had mentioned climate models, and so we take ensemble output from climate models and put them through our penguin forecasting models, which are ostensibly a black box.
Okay.
And I was just wondering whether or not you'd, essentially what you would want is like the Koshi distribution, but where you're explicitly modeling that covariation. Because if variable 1 is strongly correlated with variable 2, it doesn't make sense to waste parameter space testing one being high and the other being low, because it just doesn't work that way.
No, we've thought about it. We don't know how to deal with it very easily right now. That's sort of the next level of problem to think about there. It's just something we haven't begun to deal with at this point. We're taking baby steps in this direction, and as far as I can tell, we're the only people in astrophysics doing it at this point. And one of the things that kind of motivated us a little bit is Alan worked on a paper which has become really a seminal paper in the field of verification and validation for computational astrophysics. It really changed the whole way that people do computational astrophysics. We're trying to do the same thing with regard to, instead of verification and validation, uncertainty quantification. We're trying to get the field to start thinking about the idea of quantifying uncertainty in astrophysical simulations. And this is a very tough problem, and we're taking baby steps in this direction, but we don't have a lot of really good answers right now, truthfully.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I had another question, but I forgot it. So I'll let someone else ask their question and maybe I'll jump back in.
So this slide says an earlier version of this work. Is there an updated publication on this?
This publication down on the bottom here is there. That's the latest one we have published. We're working on one now, but truthfully, one of the things we're struggling with is the latest changes to the MESA model. We wanted to use the latest version of MESA, have created some problems, and going back to this issue here that we have. And this is one of the problems that we face. It really is a real world problem with community codes. They don't always work the way you would like them to. And it's not something that we could easily go in and fix, because this package literally has hundreds of thousands of lines of code, none of which we wrote, right? Yet this package is widely used, and to try and apply it to this problem, we had to deal with this issue of like there being certain combinations of parameters for which the code just simply won't work. And, Naomi's been struggling with that tremendously for the past year to try and work around that. So that's kind of held us up on a later version of this, which we have drafts written of, but we don't have it ready for publication yet.
Yeah, a quick question for Naomi. How did you end up automating all of this? You got literally hundreds, maybe thousands of calculations. I mean, did you end up writing a whole bunch of Python or something to keep this organized?
So I actually figured that for me to figure out how to automate this might take more time than actually just doing 6 at a time. And with the core that I used in the Seawolf cluster, I could submit 6 groups of 6 simulations at a time. And originally, before I changed the parameter space a little bit, what happened is that a lot of the simulations would diverge really, really quickly. So that led to the resolution study, change of parameters a little bit. Then things started to work really well, but I figured that also a way to keep myself organized and to make sure I didn't miss any is to just do it by hand, literally check off on paper, kind of, okay, I did this run, it's successful, I have a whole Excel file and everything. But I figured, especially because there are so many things that can go wrong in large scale simulations like this, and even this isn't really super large scale. I figured, at least for myself, doing it somewhat manually was better.
I'll also follow up on that, Robert, that basically, like, for example, some of the stuff like this tiling that we do here, one of our folks, Don Wilcox, who I mentioned, who's now a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, basically wrote a fairly sophisticated scheme in Python that basically uses coefficients of determination to basically figure out what is sort of I don't want to quite use the word optimal, but a reasonable way of breaking this up into tiles. And that's sort of all automated with Python. The post-run analysis stuff is all written in Python and kind of automated in that way.
Yeah, I mean, but the issue Naomi identified of basically, at some point you need a human in the loop to address these out of range issues. It's still a challenge.
Yeah.
And
we don't have a software pipeline that would handle all those things automatically. That'd be nice.
Let me state publicly that of the students I've worked with, Naomi has the most fortitude.
I have a quick question. I did finally remember what it was I was going to ask earlier, which is that your models, if I understand them, are deterministic, which is if you put in the same set of parameters, you always get the same answer. And that's, many climate models work that way too, which surprises me because everything that we do is stochastic. And I don't know if you think any of this changes if in fact, it's not a one-to-one mapping of inputs to outputs and how you might address that, because it could be that in fact, some of your parameters are controlling that stochastic variation in the output.
Well, there are stochastic inputs to these simulation codes. We're just not considering them here. I mean, a great example of that would be if we wanted to look at the evolution of stars, of a given mass progenitor, pre-star here, protostar, into a white dwarf. The chemical composition of that pre-stellar cloud can vary widely. And you could treat that in a stochastic fashion. We're just not doing that here. Our mission in this study was simply to figure out how to propagate incertitude and not an alleatory uncertainty. I mean, there are methods that exist for doing that already, but one of the ones we often encounter in the kind of astrophysics that we do, which is nuclear astrophysics, there are often parameters associated with things like reaction rates, the equation of state, things like that have definitive values. We just don't know what they are. And so we're trying to find a mechanism to deal with that in our simulations in a more rigorous way than we're doing right now. We literally, I mean, Al and I have all published papers where we've literally just vary the parameter over a grid and see what happens. And we're trying to think, is there a better way to do this? And so that's what we've been focusing on.
Often I was just thinking you have both. So it's like there might be, both types of uncertainty playing in at the same time. And so that's like, even you couldn't even map it out with a grid, because really what you'd have to do is 100 runs for every possible set of parameters.
Yeah. Take the grid and do 100 different possible runs, varying your other parameter, which is alleatory. Absolutely. I don't have a solution for that one either. I mean, that's just, there may be some things that we're just not in a position it may just not be tractable to do at this point, especially with large scale simulations. And again, the reason we use this particular code was it was manageable to do something like 800 runs here. If we were doing, Alan or I, one of our bigger 3D hydro simulations, we're lucky if we can get half a dozen simulations done, given the kind of computer time that's available to us. So it's just not tractable there. There's a lot of unplowed ground here that's fertile for work to be done in this area to do things better. And it's a very challenging problem. I think I think you were at the talk that Scott gave a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago. And I mean, it really is kind of one of the frontiers, I think, of computational science, is a better way of basically doing UQ and risk assessment out of these computational models. We need to do a lot better to have people really have more confidence in the results that we're predicting.
It's also a bit, you could imagine doing something a bit like an optimization, but instead of you would basically have it do some sort of search for the bounds, and so you would run it and see if it could basically search parameter space to see how big your output could be, and then search to see how low it is. And at least you're mapping out the bounds, even if you actually don't know what the structure of the uncertainty is between them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there are lots of things like that we could explore, and hopefully we will be doing things like that in the future, you know, to try and get a better feel for this. But at this point, we'd just like to get the community to start thinking about the idea of doing this. I mean, as I said, the thing that, you know, the most common thing that people have done is this uniform sampling idea. And you can see from the simple example that I showed that, you know, when you have more than a few parameters, that just becomes, it's almost insanity, because the number you get out of it, unless you're able to do an extremely large number of runs, even for a very simple function that's well behaved, you know, can give you a very widely wrong underestimate of your incertitude. So
Well,
and
we're
just having people
over.
be aware of these issues is I think you know, a step forward.
We're over, so excuse me, we better declare a victory. But feel free to write to Doug if you have additional questions, or me.
If you have good ideas, please write to me.
Very good.
And
Thank you very much. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Naomi.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
So much.